Okay, just started.
Odd sort of way.
Well, it's
An
hard.
dance and death sort of way. Should I go? Our final presenter today is Ken Monshine of the University of Massachusetts Center for Renaissance Studies. He has a fellowship with the center. And his paper is Martial Culture and Social Class in Early Modern Germany, the Case of Strasbourg. And I'll give a little bit of a bio for Ken. I'll read out the same bio that I did for the demonstration last night. Ken has a PhD in history from Fordham University, which he received in 2010. His dissertation is on Aristotelian ideas of time, which is derived from his interest in fencing. He has a fencing master certification from the United States Fencing Coaches Association in 2013, and he also jousts on horses. He has taught fencing at the Higgins Armory Museum, and in fact he taught there from 2009 to 2013, which was the closing of the museum, very unfortunately. And he's currently adjuncting and teaching fencing, as well as a visiting fellow at the UMass Center for Renaissance Studies. He has several books out: Fencing, a Renaissance Treatise from 2009, The Knightly Art of Battle from 2011, Art of the Two-Handed Sword from 2014, Can These Bones Come to Life, also from 2014, Game of Thrones and the Medieval Art of Warfare, shortly to be forthcoming. Also a recent book chapter, The Italian Schools of Fencing in Late Medieval and Early Modern Fight Books. And he has another book coming out, Making Time, from the Johns Hopkins University Press, which is a translation of the Fiore dei Liberi.
Thank
Thank
you.
you very much.
Thank you. I'm going to break a little bit with common custom. I found that if I read from a paper, I wind up mumbling to that paper and losing my place. So I've actually prefer to sort of speak alphabetically from the PowerPoint. And thank you very much, Dr. Hofstadter, for that paper, because I'm speaking about the flip side now. We just learned about the effectiveness of artillery in, I won't say urban warfare, but say siege warfare of the 16th century. And we're going to look now at the flip side and look at the phenomenon of fencing and how fencing fit into that world. So this is based very much on, I should give some credit where credit's due first. My friend Olivier Dupuis's really involved archival research. He's a native of Strasbourg, and his dive into the archives. So a lot of the primary research is from him. I've also done a little bit of archival diving there and various other correlations to put together this rather interesting picture. So I'm going to handle today a little background on the history and governance of Strasbourg. We'll talk about martial culture in early modern Germany, borrowing heavily from Anne Tolstoy's rather excellent martial ethic in early modern Germany. I'm going to talk about Fechtschules, what they are. And I'm not a Germanist. I actually was working on France, so please excuse my pronunciation of terms. I'm going to talk about fencing and make an argument for these fencing competitions, which is what Fechtschules are, despite the name, as a working class sport. And then I'm going to talk about Joachim Meyer. I've got Jeffrey Forgang's translation of his book right here, if anyone wants to peruse it after the paper. I'll talk about these fencing as a 16th century medievalism, as a recollection of an earlier, perhaps more enfranchised time. And then I'll talk finally about the afterlife of der ritterliche Kunst, the fence as the art of fencing was sometimes poetically called. So let's start with the history of Strasbourg. So the most salient points, of course, what I don't have on here is how in 1680s it was annexed by France. Of course, to say it's part of France, not the Holy Roman Empire, but of course Strasbourg, back in the Middle Ages, early modern period, was a free city of the Holy Roman Empire. They expelled their Prince Bishop in 1292. 1332, the guilds established a republican form of government. There was, of course, a famous pogrom, more conflicts with the patricians. The cathedral, of course, finished 1439, that was being constructed all that time. For a while, the largest building in the world, certainly the largest building in Western Europe, figures prominently in the cityscape, great source of civic pride. And then, of course, 1482, most saliently, another revolution established the government as it was for our period of study. So let's look very briefly at how the government of Strasbourg worked. Most importantly were the guilds. There are 20 of these guilds. To vote in the Republic, you had to be male, a guild member, over 25 if you're married, or over 30. Notice the importance of marriage in civic life. And they elected 15 senior masters to the council. And in there's a variety of overlapping and also mutually separate fields. The Zunft are very important. Also are the Konstellation, which are the societies, the exclusive societies for the patricians, for the urban nobles, who are a distinct group. About 3,000 of the 20,000 people living in Strasbourg could vote. So we have a large number of people who are not enfranchised there in Strasbourg. Anyway, the senators, namely Meister, the chief magistrate, the mayor, if you would, and he has 4 stepmeisters who are patricians who are elected for the Konstellation. They form the Council of 15 for domestic affairs, and the Council of 13 for, there's a Council of 13 for foreign affairs, and then you put them together and add a few supernumeraries, and then you have the Council of 21, which actually has 30-odd people in it. But the Council of 21 is sort of the supreme governing body, and it's important because it's in the records of the Council of 21, the Rats Protocol, that Olivier found the requests to hold Fechtschules, and why these had to be, this required some pretty deep diving, and I'll discuss why in a moment. So let's talk a bit now about the other critical piece of background, is martial culture in early modern Germany. This is a now lost window from the Strasbourg Cathedral, late 14th century, showing the guild militia, because the guilds were also helped to form the civic militia, which was a great source of civic pride. You could see the guild members going out in carts, and then you have the patricians riding horses because they formed the cavalry. And being able to own weapons and to serve in this was a great source of civic pride. 1482, that, for instance, there was a, just as they couldn't own weapons, but valets and workmen, Dienstsknecht, day workers, could not go on military expeditions. And without getting into the full military history of Strasbourg, suffice it to say that the civic militia, which is what it was, served in numerous battles. They had some notable victories, which they are justly proud of, in some conflicts. But by the early 16th century, really the battlefield was being ruled by mercenaries. There was like one last sort of farcical early 16th century expedition where a Strasburger was being held prisoner unjustly by a robber lord, and Strasbourg militia deployed, and the guy had actually already been set free, so they like shot up his dovecoat and drank all his beer and went home. So it becomes sort of farcical, but still, this martial ideology remains, and it figures very, very large in the civic propaganda and sort of the official culture of Strasbourg. Tolstoy's entire point in her book is that by the quote there, right, in the 16th century, this idea of bearing arms, carrying arms, which I mean sidearms, really, but having arms, and also, of course, also shooting, this idea of being a good shot, as the Anabaptists clearly were at Munster, was synonymous with the idea of citizenship. Good citizenship was synonymous with this assumption of martial skill. I kind of jokingly yesterday called it Bürgerlich Martialissimus, on the model of Bürgerlich Humanissimus, right? Barron's idea of civic humanism. So it's a civic martialism. And of course, this has elements of masculinity. As a man, you need to be able to defend your honor with sword if need be. And there's this sort of pan-Germanic understanding. For instance, Germans don't thrust against each other. You cut, right? That there's this whole code of honor, which is associated with it. You don't, if you thrust at somebody, you get in a lot of legal trouble if you're trying to stab them, because that's a fatal wound, right? Especially in that day and age. But you cut them, that's okay, all's okay in defense of your honor. First you hit them with the flat of the sword, then the edge, then if you're really in trouble, maybe you can make a case for self-defense if you run them through. But despite these things about edged weapon, use of edged weapons, in the official culture of the city, and quite practically, shooting sports were far more important. That they were more officially promoted. The biggest example of this is a very famous 1576 shooting competition with Zurich, which was commemorated in verse by the Strasbourg literati Johann Fischart, who is well known if you study Strasbourg literature at least. And he's also a very famous anti-Catholic polemicist. And we'll be seeing Fischart again in a moment, but he wrote this whole epic poem, and famously the Zurichers got there in 18 hours and a pot of porridge they had cooked was still warm. I don't know if anyone wanted to eat it, but they carried the thing downstream with them. And there's this great panoramic view of it that was engraved by Tobias Stimmer, who had also collaborated with Fischart on some anti-Catholic propaganda. And this all has a lot to do with, of course, the alliance between the Protestant cities. Strasbourg, of course, was Lutheran rather early, and they against the emperor. And there were other records of shooting competitions, though, quite a number of them. 1466, 1527. In the 15th century, there's a number of them, and of course, this was a common recreation. That there were a lot of Schützenfest, and of course, if you know anything about Schützenbund, I mean, we had them in America. They persisted. They came over to America. There's facing Manhattan in Hoboken, New Jersey. There's the Schützen Park, where German immigrants to the U.S. I mean, this tradition of civic shooting persisted for a very long time in Germany and got brought over to the United States. We can see, I think, in some engravings of this is the Nuremberg Codex. We can see in these engravings of Strasbourg. Here's a colorized version. This shift, even in the cityscape, you can see the shift to the importance of gunpowder weapons. Here is typical medieval walls, right? You've got land, but you've got the rivers and the river gates and such. But you've got crenellations, you've got round towers. Of course, it's the cathedral. They actually had to, add a bit there to put the cathedral on. It goes up into the text. This is obviously someone took a razor blade to the book and colorized it. But then let's look here. Here is 1570. So after the Peace of Augsburg, after those problems, but before the Strasbourg Bishops' War. And look, you've got these Tres Italiane, look at how they dug these canals to prevent the walls from being stormed. I mean, this is all, and there's still remnants of these fortifications around Strasbourg, but look how they've done these artillery fortifications and built things out in this growing city. Here's an overhead view from 2 years later. You can get an idea of the siege works and the water, right? The fortifications built to provide overlapping fields of fire, also defense against siege artillery, until finally here, look here, this is 1644, at the end of the 30 Years' War, the typical star fort shape with these bastions and everything. It's, the very landscape is optimized for use of artillery. And when Louis XIV rides in, and he's greeted by a salute of 300 cannon. The Strasbourgs are very proud. The Strasbourgers they manufacture firearms, it's a big industry, and they are very, very proud of their firearms culture. And what's more, there's not, people don't really regulate ownership of firearms. If you can have one, great. I mean, this is not the South Side of Chicago. They're not worried about people having guns. There's a civic target range. Most of the regulations for firearms is don't shoot them off within a league of the town. In one case, because you'll frighten the pregnant women. Of course, Strasbourg is surrounded by marshland. There are a lot of water birds. It would have been very tempting to shoot them from the pot. And the only anti-gun laws I found were imperial promulgations don't manufacture certain types of firearms. I think it was something to do with something with a hair trigger or something. Weird that they should record those anyway. On the other hand, carrying and using sidearms, wide arms, bladed weapons, tightly regulated. Forbidden to low-level workers and foreigners. This was reiterated 7 times between 1418 and 1502. 1519, prohibition against them forming groups and fighting in bands, which of course was a common pastime in medieval cities. If you look at the Gioco de Pupi in various Italian cities, don't do that. big concern for low-level workers' violence. You mustn't carry a non-customary weapon, though of course you keep in mind that a mess or a knife by this point is basically a machete, and people are carrying those around. You find a lot of reference to those in contemporary Fechtschules. Only citizens can carry weapons at night. Foreigners have to leave their weapons with their innkeeper. That the council in the 16th century, undated regulation, says that if someone's wounded by a bladed weapon, it has to be tried by the council. It's pretty serious. I mentioned the prohibition against thrusting. And on the other hand, you can buy and sell all sorts of bladed weapons. So it's, there's no problem buying and selling things, and people, of course, have personal armories. But who can carry and who can have these is a big question. So we have here this dichotomy. We've got this problem. Tolstoy is calling this sword less significant than shooting sports, and she's quite right, because civic government supported and encouraged the use of firearms, ownership of firearms, the practice of firearms, but who's shooting? On the other hand, we also have this magnificent fencing book from Strasbourg, Joachim Meyer's, and I'm going to bungle the pronunciation, but I love saying these words, Gründliche Beschreibung der Kunst des Fechtens. I love saying Beschreibung because it's just a fun word, which is just immense, rich thing. Where is this coming from? And I'm going to discuss what Meyer's doing and where he's coming from, and where this artifact, this expensive fencing book is coming from towards the end of the paper. Let's first talk about records of fencing schools. So what's the place of fencing schools in this culture? Olivier had to dig pretty deep, and if you're going to have a fecht school, you had to petition the Council of 21, right? You had to petition the city government. He found 1,542 event applications, of which 1,338 were granted, authorized to take place. Right? What is a fecht school? Well, there was a fencing tournament. Olivier also found records of fencing competitions as far back as the 15th century in Strasbourg, but this was not called a fecht school. This was some sort of tournament. Clearly, the term fecht school took its meaning sometime in perhaps the early 16th century. Winfeling, the humanist, contemporary of Erasmus, correspondent of Erasmus, proposed having a humanist fecht school. He called it a fecht school. What he meant was a gymnasium, right? He meant a gymnasium. But this is like the closest thing he can think to translate this idea of the Greek gymnasium into German, was a place where you exercise, right? Where you develop yourself and exercise your body. He meant, which of course, the Greek gymnasium also had martial implications, and here, of course, we see that civic martialism. So, at its full form, what a fecht school was a public fencing exhibition / tournament. The people would be charged to come in, their masters who held it, and the people who held these described themselves usually as a fechtmeister, and they would also make money off of it. The council was very concerned that there'd be disorder at these spectacles, sort of you can think of like boxing matches, or bear baiting, perhaps in Elizabethan England. These are sort of maybe rough and ready spectacles. And it was forbidden to have them in public places. They did not allow them to have them in the market. In one case, Joachim Meyer asked to have it at a canon's house of the cathedral chapter. That was forbidden. They apologized because he already printed up the flyers advertising it. And they usually had them actually at the guild halls, of which, again, there were 20 guild halls. These fecht schools do not really appear in any narrative sources, at least that we can tell. Unfortunately, the Strasbourg archives were shelled by the Prussians during the Franco-Prussian War, so most of what we have is stuff that was reprinted in the 19th century. But if we look at what we have, Johann Wencker, supposedly this is from the famous Strasbourg letter Sebastian Brandt. Most people think this was later invention by a later person, Johann Wencker and his family in the 1630s, who recorded some regulations for fecht school in 1511, saying that they were going to have these they did in other places. Kunast's Chronicle, this mention comes from 2 years before Kunas himself was born, maybe came from earlier sources that are now lost. A woman supposedly took part in a Fecht school, and this was notable enough that this is being written about a generation later. More mentions, we have a Frenchman at the, sort of the end of our period, Barthelot de Monacis, 2 years before the publication of his book of his travels, mentions watching a Fecht school in Strasbourg. And finally, contemporary with sort of the greater period in which these things happened, Fechtschules, his Gargantua, 1575, which is sort of a translation slash adaptation of Rabelais, has Gargantua, or Kiro Gargantua, taking part in a Fecht school. Of course, this is a bit of satire. This is sort of a low-class thing to do. He talks about he shows up with all these weapons to show, his Fechter, his school recht, right? His school right to show he's a scholar, and then there's a whole catalog of all these techniques which ultimately come from the Liechtenauer tradition that apparently, this is current enough, and that this is enough part of culture that Fechtschules was aware of this, and that he would expect his audience to be aware of this sort of catalog of techniques and all these weapons, but the center is kind of making fun of this. Sort of like, perhaps, we might archly make fun of professional wrestling today. So that's the contemporary thing. Whoop, don't want the shark anymore. Come on. What are you doing here? All right. Slideshow, play concurrent set. For some reason I hit something wrong and my calculator came up. So what did Olivier find in Lerat's protocol, right? Well, let's look at this and see what we can see about the place and the context of the Fecht school in the Council of 21 records. First thing, here is his graph with my amendations of the frequency of Fecht school. You can see that their high point, they're being held, if not every week, close to every other week, and it does go up and down. And the frequency is closely correlated with what's happening in the empire. For instance, we start getting this jump after the Peace of Augsburg, and then increases in popularity. This dip here is likely due to the Strasbourg Bishops' War, which was most of the fighting is over by 1593. It was about, nominally about Catholics and Protestants in the Strasbourg Bishops' chapter. They had a rather complicated compromise. And then, of course, we come here, 1618, defenestration of Prague goes way down. Brief revival after the imperial victory of Stockholm. 1630, the Swedish intervention. Yeah, we've got better things to do, right? Like fighting the Swedes. And then a brief revival after the Peace of Westphalia. Though really, by the time of the French annexation, I think 1683, it is close to, they're really past their high point. But as you can see, this was a significant thing. These things are happening pretty often. I mean, if you're bored on a Monday in Strasbourg, which was Journeyman's day off, you might go there. Olivier's table again of notable Fechtmeister. Most of the people who had multiple applications, there's only about 20% of all the applications, but you have, they tend to be burghers of Strasbourg, though some are from elsewhere. However, the Strasburger are by no means the majority. He analyzed them because the demands asked also for. They mentioned guild. They mentioned who they are, right? Whether it was where they're from, whether it was denied or whatnot. Because of course, to be a citizen of the town, you had to be a member of the guild. You had to have a trade or you something like a respectable person. So these are respectable people, but mostly people. The most interesting thing is these guys came from all over. Here is a map showing the origins of these people asking to hold Fecht school. If you'd like the breakdown, yeah, most people, the most frequency is from Strasbourg, but people from Augsburg and Nuremberg, also very big important cities, very much represented. Danzig, a number of them, Munich, Ulm, Breslau, Berlin, and Königsberg. But of course, there's 400 different locations mentioned. So these are people who really from all of the empire, who are coming to Strasbourg and asking to hold Fechtschules. So, what do we got? What do we have from this evidence? Right? They're guild members, they're in the guilds, they have professions, but they're from all different towns. They are, much as, my conclusion then, these things are being held on journeyman's days off as well. My conclusion that these are journeymen, that this fencing culture in the Holy Roman Empire, and remember, as I mentioned yesterday, the vast majority of Fechtschules that we have were created in the 16th century, but that this is a bit of journeyman culture. This is popular culture. This is the sub-elite culture of the empire. Much as journeymen did, because journeymen would form their own confraternities, and at this point, they're increasingly not living with their masters. They're living in boarding houses. They're forming their own confraternities. They're forming their own organizations, and the fencing masters did that too. Really going back to at least the 15th century, the Marksbrüder, and then of course. They can see perhaps some evidence of the Marksbrüder being Catholic aligned during the era of the Reformation, and the Freifechter, which Meyer identifies himself with, as being perhaps Protestant. That you've got these two sort of two different groups saying who gets to be who gets to call themselves a Fechtmeister, and that you can apprentice and you can learn. You learn from a master for a while, and then you yourself become a master, and you can start charging people money for doing this. There is this idea of Fechtgebrauch, this idea of fencing custom, that there is the right way and the wrong way to fence, and in the case of accidents in legal cases, and Tolstoy discusses this, in legal cases someone gets killed in the Fechtschool, which did happen, or severely wounded, like, well, was the person fighting with a Fechtgebrauch, and it was just an unfortunate thing that happened, no thrusting, were they fencing like an asshole? No, they weren't. No, they were under Fechtgebrauch, and which is something that you need because they really use very minimal, if any, safety equipment. And so, if someone's fencing nicely with the rules and not, trying to, murder the other person, well, it's okay. They're not. Then it's not murder, right? It's an unfortunate accident. So my conclusion is that this is, and of course, with the city council's, concerns with disorder. So the conclusion is that this is a working class sport amongst journeymen, and that this is an element of non-official martial culture. And there's a lot of reasons to do this, of course. Because the journeymen in the 16th century were becoming, as our Marxist historians will tell us, increasingly proletarianized. But in this environment, it's this assertion of enfranchisement, it's an assertion of masculinity, of an alternative sort of masculinity, where especially with Protestantism, being a man is increasingly associated with being married and having children, and being a householder. But a lot of these guys are never going to be able to become guild masters, but they can be Fechtmeister, right? They can be fencing masters. It gives them a bit of extra money, which is appreciated. It's of course a diversion and sport, but it also helps serve a need for affiliation because they're forming these fencing confraternities, they're forming these fencing subcultures, these guild-like organizations. So it fulfills a lot of needs in their world. And I think we can see in Joachim Meyer's biography, he would make an excellent microhistory. Olivier has found a number of interesting documents about his life. He was a Messerschmitt, a knife maker. He was probably born in Basel. Olivier found parish records of his baptism. He was very lucky because most journeymen, I mentioned, they wouldn't gain master status, but he could practice his trade because he married a Strasbourg native Apollonian Roman, a widow in 1560, a widow of a citizen. Olivier found 5 records of his applying for a Fechtschool. He also have record of him teaching, because another person who applied for a Fechtschool says that he was his teacher. He wrote his first fencing book, which is in Lund, Sweden right now. It was a manuscript for Count Otto of Solms-Miesenberg and Sonnenwald in 1568. At that time, Otto was studying in Strasbourg at the Protestant Academy. Again, we're talking here, he's a Lutheran lord, and he might have learned from Meyer. And then 2 years later, he decides he's going to take a really big risk. He he dates the introduction February 24th, I think, 1570, and he makes the Grundlich Beschreibung, which he dedicates to Johann Casimir, the Protestant, Count Palatine of the Rhine and Duke of Bavaria, 1570. And he takes off for Speyer because the Imperial Diet's meeting there, and he says, aha, I can sell my book there, and I can make my fortune and become and get a commission from a noble. And he actually gets named fencing master to Duke Johann Albert I, again a Protestant, and he sets off for the court in the middle of the winter, 1570-1571, gets sick on the journey, and dies in February 1571, about a year after his book was published. So, it's sort of how should we say it? It's a bit tragic in the Aristotelian sense, really. What does this mean? Well, what can we get from this, right? Meyer's book is replete with reference to an imagined better past. In the past, he cites Henry I as founding the true chivalric school of German fencing. He contains the Lichtenauer verses, which first mention of those is Nuremberg Codex 3227a, 1389 roughly, which is roughly at least 2 centuries old at this point. And of course, numerous appeals to Germans, German custom, Fensterbrach, the fatherland, etc. There's sort of this pan-German understanding. This is something that was practiced throughout the empire. It's a subculture from throughout the empire. So he's continuing noble patronage, and I do have an idea, which I need to work on more, that there was this sort of the nobles were also looking at this imagined past, at this better past, this more chivalrous past. And then you have this whole class of sort of artisan Fechtmeister who are willing to write Fechtbücher for them and try to make a profit off this. And they're sort of both looking at the Middle Ages as this sort of better time against modernity and an anti-modern tendency. So let's talk. So this is interesting, and I think there's a lot of that in sort of the modern revival of this art too, that people are looking at the past for a better, purer time. I'm going to handle this in my Kalamazoo paper if anyone is interested, that this is a better, purer, manlier past, a more authentic national past, and this reaction against modernity. So very briefly, what happened to der Riddle Kunst? Well, by the annexation, Fechtschules were almost known. 5 minutes? Okay. Trust me, I've got 2 minutes left.
Sorry.
Okay. Daniel Martin wrote a German-French conversation book in 1637. One of the conversations takes place in a fencing school. And he expects rapier and dagger, though he also says, well, there's also the German matter of fencing. In the 18th century, the royal official, the Praetor in charge of governing Strasbourg, gives a monopoly to Michael Martin, who is trained in Paris. He's teaching the court method, the court sort of Paris, and he's the only one really authorized to teach fencing in Strasbourg. Danzig had already banned Fechtschules in 1647. They said this is not at all necessary for civic defense. We should get everyone training with pikes and muskets. But nonetheless, I think the subculture, the signs that the subculture continues well into the 18th century, really until the Napoleonic Wars. Meyer's reprinted in Augsburg in 1660. There's a plagiarism of it in 1679. Until they're even mentioned by an anonymous 18th century work, which only exists as a typed up copy. Christoph Amberger, a fencing historian down in Baltimore, has it. The Junker von A mentions these cloth fechters who keep to this old Lichtenauer school, which by this point is centuries old. But it comes to be that even fechter it becomes synonymous with a wandering iterant beggar. So you've got this falls out of being something respectable that artisans could do and even seek noble patronage, but it continues as a sort of subculture in the empire. These sort of wandering fencers, and that is the conclusion of that. Assuming we want to do questions, I'll leave the camera on.
So we still have a couple minutes maybe for a question or two. Questions?
So I had a question for Ken, actually.
Sure.
So when you were giving the statistics for the cities of origin of the Spanish lifestyle, it appeared that hardly any of them came from the north, right? Is there like a competing martial culture in the north or something? Or what is the reason that it's mostly middle Germany and southern Germany?
I don't know, I think perhaps it's just where the, maybe the more significant populous cities are. I mean, Danzig's kind of northern, but, I don't know, just, it's.
Well, I mean, there were a few here and there, right? But,
Yeah.
Lubeck and so forth, but.
That was where this shared culture of this school of fencing was. I couldn't give a good answer why not really knowing the social and cultural differences of northern Germany, or, you know, like there weren't any really in Hamburg, I think. How significant was Hamburg back then as a city? Was it a place where, you know, where that might have taken place? It seems to be more a common understanding, again, around those cities. And there's probably along these established networks along which journeymen travel, and I guess, you know, those northern cities were just not in that network. Maybe they were more perhaps in the Swedish sphere, right? I mean, or some sort of Baltic economy as opposed to this central southern German economy. I don't know enough about the subject to venture a guess.
Other questions? I just wanted to say, like, to me, I felt like the three papers came together really nicely, but it was maybe from a slightly different lens than the title for the session, because I felt like all three of your papers dealt with the kind of breaking down of our traditional ideas about chivalry. You know, you started off by saying these knights are terrible. They're robbers. They're killing people just on a whim. And then, you know, you talked, Ronald, about the other side, after chivalry is gone, and what happens then was artillery and how effective artillery is, and then especially the side of the losers. And then, you know, Ken, you finished off by talking, in fact, to me at least, it seems, I mean, just because I'm ignorant, but it seems like there's this attempt to kind of revive some kind of remnant of chivalry, but it comes from the working class, so it doesn't come from the class that we might expect. So I just thought that all three papers worked really nice in that way, in terms of really bringing out these things with the medieval and the early modern periods that we don't typically think of, especially when we think of chivalry. But I don't have a question. I just thought that was kind of nice.
Yeah, I thought so too. I thought they really came together really nicely that way.
Yeah.
And especially the way the firearms went right into the fencing too.
Well, I think that one thing that people are rethinking is the role of gunpowder and chivalry, that they're not necessarily antithetical,
Yeah.
that they work together, because, I don't know if any of you read the latest, well, there's the most recent biography of Richard III, of course, coming from, they dug him up. They've also been doing a lot of research on the battle where he died. And what they're finding as they dig into the ground is lots and lots of cannonballs, shot of all sizes, which people didn't realize, that this was an integral part of, you know, at this period, and it goes back to the 1300s. That knights were used to, as well as the infantry, were used to dealing with firearms. They're not so antithetical as they might have been. And yeah, in a siege situation, the man on horseback was pretty useless.
Yeah.
Of course, in the Middle Ages, most knights did not fight on horseback. He got off and fought. It was not uncommon to fight from horseback, but it wasn't something you did all the time.
Even
So-
in Mallory, I mean, these guys, they go for each other, and within seconds, within a paragraph, they're
Yeah.
off their horses and
Yeah,
Fighting
because
each other.
fighting off of a horse is very difficult to do, and once you've expended your lance, there's nothing, no advantage to being on a horse.
yeah.
You get off.
Well, tell me about it, but yeah, you can wheel around. I mean, if you're good enough, I mean, the advantage of a horse, I mean, you're also seeing a mass battle situation, but for skirmishing, for chevauché, the advantage of a horse is like any cavalry historically is mobility.
Yes.
And so you can get from place to place on the battle, even if you don't have a lance. Even if you're a dragoon of some sort, you get off, you shoot crossbows, get back on your horse, or shoot crossbows from horseback. That's the advantage on the battlefield.
Particularly on the continent, the one thing that is, I think, underestimated is the role of mercenaries, Landsknechte. If you see pictures of the Landsknechte, they even determined fashion for men. There are these fashion plates, actual fashion plates of how a Landsknecht would dress. Really great pantaloons of red and blue and great big plumed hats. This again is something sort of like what you're talking about, people getting above their station through money in this case. They were pretty boys and they were also homicidal maniacs because that's what they did for a living. And I think this little poem comes from an experience of a man who was a Landsknecht. It was his first experience of combat. He doesn't seem to have been very experienced, or he would have been more attuned to the horrors of this thing. And I think that happened to a lot of young men, particularly from my ancestral background, Switzerland, where it became a plague in society, that's what young men did. They became these Landsknecht, these mercenaries, and they just were ruined for life. When they came back, they were wrecks, or they were just homicidal maniacs.
Well, similar experience to World War I, to the lost generation of World War I, to Vietnam, to what we're seeing now.
On that order, yeah, yeah.
It's 12 o'clock as the clock tells us, so it's time for us to head over for lunch. I'm
Yay.
sorry, we're 5 minutes over. Thank you
Thank you.
again. It
All
was
right.
wonderful, 3 really wonderful talks.